So thank you, everybody. This is the second of Princeton Public Library's Zoom programs for our summer reading program, which is Dig Deeper. So this is our kind of our first more of the adult and teen interest one. So I'm very happy to welcome Zach Nissen, who I have known ever since he was in high school. Zach is a PhD candidate at Northwestern University. He's been doing research on a PhD in anthropology at a Mayan site in Belize. So he's going to talk about kind of how he came into archaeology, what the field of archaeology is, and then he's going to talk a little bit about his field work.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you everyone for coming. I will share my screen. So as Ron mentioned, my talk today is mostly going to be about what is archaeology. Go through. There we go. Okay, and so the rough outline of what we'll be talking about today is the first section is going to be a little text heavy. I'm going to do some background knowledge for you all, some introducing of the field, talk about how archaeologists assess things and places and how we make inferences about people. And then I'll have a little activity that I do with my students in the Intro to Archaeology class. So we'll get to that, and hopefully that's a moment where you all can interact and interject and apply some of the concepts that we learned. And then Ron asked me to talk about how I got into archaeology. So I'll talk about my early interest in academia when I was in high school, and then how in college I changed fields within the first week, and then got into doing fieldwork in archaeology. And then I'll talk about, towards the end, my research as a PhD candidate at Northwestern. As Ron mentioned, I've been doing archaeological research at an ancient Maya city known as Aventura since 2015. So I'll talk a little bit about that, give you some background into the fieldwork that I've done, and then some of the research questions that I'm interested in asking. And then I'll close with some of the findings that I've found. And after each of these three sections, I'll have some time for questions. So this is geared to be an introductory sort of talk, and I'm hoping that if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them for you, and I'll have my email at the end. So Ron is going to post the recording of this. So if you go back through it and you have any questions that you weren't able to ask me in the moment, go ahead and send me an email, which will be shared at the end. Okay. So the first question, what is archaeology even? Archaeology is one of the 4 subfields in anthropology, which is the study of humanity. Broadly speaking, anthropology is just about the study of people. And so there are 4 subfields, at least sort of main subfields within anthropology. There's biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and then anthropological archaeology, which is what we'll talk about today. But just as some background, if you're not even familiar with anthropology, biological anthropology is the study of human biological characteristics and how they evolved in relation to society and culture. So I have colleagues in my department, as an example for this, that study, one of my friends is studying biological anthropology, and he conducts his fieldwork in South Africa. And so his research is about the biological impacts of being a member of post-apartheid South Africa, and seeing the strain that put on humans' biology, and then the way that gets transmitted across generations. So he does a lot of interviews to do family histories, and he's actually looking at how biology was impacted by this social process. Then there's cultural anthropology, which is the study of human culture and society with a focus on interviewing and observing the daily lives of contemporary societies. And so this is probably what anthropology is most famous for. This is, if you have any preconceived idea of what an anthropologist is, this is the person that goes out and hangs out with people, which is called participant observation, and takes down a bunch of notes, observing the sort of day-to-day lives of regular people. And then talking about things like religion and politics, and getting a broader idea of what contemporary societies are like. Then there is linguistic anthropology, This is the study of human language and the ways it varies according to social and cultural factors. So another example of this from my own department is one of the faculty in my department wrote a book. It's actually getting a little older now, called Advertising Diversity. And she went to California and she did some participant observation in some tech startups and observed the ways people in technology industries talked about diversity and analyzed the language that they use to talk about other social processes that were involved in discussions of diversity. And then, of course, for our talk today, there is archaeology, which is the study of human society, especially those in the past through material culture. So what is material culture? That is the buildings, the tools, and other artifacts that make up the material or physical remains of human society. And so that might be sort of technical, but this comes into play with four different things that archaeologists talk about when they talk about material culture. We talk about artifacts, we talk about ecofacts, we talk about features, and we talk about sites. So artifacts are objects that have been modified by people or made by people. Ecofacts are organic or environmental remains that are not made by people. And then features are these sort of non-movable remains of human activity. I'm going to give an example in a little bit. This is still pretty jargony. And then sites are places where artifacts, ecofacts, and features are all found together. And so leading into our activity, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, I have an example of a trash pit here, which is an example of something an archaeologist might excavate. And so the artifacts here in this trash pit are just the trash. It's the cans and the bottles in the plastic bag. The ecofacts are any of the twigs or rocks that wouldn't have been sort of naturally deposited there. It's things that fell in after the deposit was created. It's those types of things. The feature in of itself is the entire pit. It's the entire collection of the dirt and the artifacts, and it's sort of what we would identify it as. Another, I think feature is one of the more confusing terms here that people haven't heard that much. And so a feature might be an example of like a building. The room you're in would be an archaeological feature. As archaeologists, when we dig things, we're not normally finding an entire preserved room unless you work on monumental buildings and things. So I think a trash pit is actually a really great example. And it's one of the things that I'll talk about that I've had a lot of extensive experience digging on my own fieldwork. And then the site is just the location that these various features, ecofacts, and artifacts are found at. So here in the picture shown, it could be this park. Or if you're digging an archaeological site, you would talk about the entire collection of buildings. And so the site that I work at is an ancient Maya city. And so you'll see some of these terms come up as I talk about my own research. But how do we identify and collect material culture for analysis? There are three main processes that archaeologists do. We do survey, we do excavation, and then we do analysis of the materials collected. And so the bottom left-hand image you see on the slide is a picture of me and my colleagues conducting survey in Belize. It's where we walk around and measure distance apart and we scan the ground looking for artifacts or features. And so one way that we might find a feature by doing survey is by seeing the physical remains of a building. So one of the things that we were doing here, you'll see the map of the site later. Mounds in Belize are just raised parts of the ground, and it's actually where an ancient Maya building was. And so you can excavate those locations. So you identify that as just a raised part of the ground, or you can identify collections of artifacts. So if you were doing a survey and you wanted to look for trash deposits, you would look for on the surface large quantities of artifacts all in one area. And so you can see in the bottom right-hand image, the next thing, once you've done your initial survey and you know what the sort of area you're looking at looks like and the potential archaeological features, then you can start excavating. And so you can see here on the bottom right-hand image is an excavation of a household that you'll see sort of later on that I conducted with my colleagues in Belize this past summer in 2019. And then the top corner, because I don't have a lot of analysis pictures, this is actually one of our project ceramicists in 2015 when we were doing survey. She was collecting artifacts and doing some preliminary analysis outside in the field. So she was looking at artifacts because her specialty is analyzing ceramics. And so she's looking at a ceramic there. But normally that kind of analysis is done in a lab setting after excavations are complete. So one of the most important things that archaeologists are looking for and looking to identify is context. So context is the immediate surrounding of an artifact or piece of material culture. And so for archaeologists, contexts are the most important in describing where an object was found, such as the type of soil or location and its relationship to other artifacts. So in the trash example I was just talking about, the feature would be the context, right? And what would be important in the context is describing the entire thing. You would describe the type of soil, you would describe the types of artifacts you were finding, and then you would give it the context designation as a trash pit. And so for archaeologists, context is the most important because without context, you can't actually say what you're looking at, right? You could pick up one of those cans from that trash, but if you don't know where it was found or what it was found in, you can't say anything about it. It's just a can, right? But if you want to say anything interesting, you have to know the context in which it was found in its relationship to other things. So you can say, this can was found in the trash, and this is how I know I found it with this type of soil. I found this many other of the same types of artifacts in this one context. And so that's how I know what it is. And so as you'll see later on when I talk about my household excavations, context becomes really important in terms of comparing. One of the main parts of my project, because I excavate ordinary people's households or commoner households for archaeologists, is by comparing those ordinary people to those of elites, those with more things. So to make the arguments that I make, it involves a lot of comparison. And so archaeology is a big collaborative project. And so I'll highlight some of that when we actually talk about my work. But one of the main takeaways I hope for this talk is that context is one of the most important things for archaeologists. It's what allows us to make our arguments. And so, I already walked us through the example. So for the example, this is his trash pit. And again, all of this information together, archaeologists are big about documentation. It's all of this information together that enables us to infer things about human activities and cultural phenomena. And so one of the most important things that you'll hear archaeologists say is often you'll see us draw clear distinctions from looters, just in that oftentimes looting is about collecting pretty things and selling them or just putting them on display. For archaeologists, the main thing we do is gather information and make arguments about human society and human behavior and human activity. And so without that context information, it's harder for us to do our jobs and to make arguments and have information about humans. Okay, so we're gonna do our activity now. And so maybe I'll ask if you can put in the chat or if you wanna unmute yourself. We can go ahead and do that in a minute. I'm gonna describe the activity and then we can go ahead and do so for a couple of minutes. But again, this is an activity I do with my students to really get you into the act of analyzing our archaeological materials. And so what I did here is I took a picture, because normally what I would do with my students is I would collect a bunch of materials from my own garbage or recycling in this case, and I would assemble them into groups and I would put them on tables and they would go through and they would take notes on the things that they found, which I've sort of done here for you. And then I would ask them to tell me who you think left this deposit. And so what I'll ask for this activity is that if you know me, I'll ask you to pretend as if you don't know me, and that we're not in a pandemic, and that we found this when we were going on a survey and we excavated these materials from a trash pit, right? And so I will go ahead and list the things for you so you have an idea in case you can't read them. We have two LaCroix cans, one lemon and one lime. We have an organic unsweetened almond milk box. We have a box from protein bars. We have a parchment paper box. We have an organic turkey burger box. We have a box from a Dove bar soap. We have a body and paw pet wipe box, a wine bottle, and a rubber band labeled organic carrots. So with these 10 different types of objects, based on the information that I've given you so far, both the things, the artifacts, and the context, letting you know that it's trash, what are some of the things that you might be able to say about the people that deposited this trash?
Okay, and I've unmuted everybody, or not unmuted, but you can unmute yourself if you want to comment.
We've got some chat. Yes. So one thing you can tell right off the bat, the piece that I would look at and say that's super diagnostic, which means you can say a lot from it, is the pet white box. The other thing is that this person cares about what they put into their body. Eat healthy, yes. So you can already say that the people in this household, based on your knowledge of what these artifacts might mean to our contemporary society, are that this person has pets and that they take care of them. The person can drink, yes. The person or people who deposited these artifacts are older than 21 because societally we have a law about drinking at 21 years of age or older. Might be able to bake. That would be possibly one of the activities that you could highlight here. That is a great insight. Any last
person
one?
might have some dietary restrictions or dietary preferences.
Yes, that is exactly what I was going for with this. Yeah. And so I think one of the things with disassemblage is that we're only able to make limited claims because it's a heavily curated assemblage. If you were actually going through the trash, you would want to make note of everything you found. And this is just 10 things from my recycling right before I took it out yesterday. And so one of the things that you could claim is that I have a dog or dogs, which I have 2. I am older than 21. I can drink. We do have some dietary restrictions in my household. Me and my partner are both, we can't consume dairy, so we drink a lot of almond milk, and we try to eat relatively healthy. So we do the turkey burgers instead of regular burgers, but it's our quick way of making food when we don't actually have the time to cook dinner or the energy to cook dinner. My partner does have a baking habit. So that's why the parchment paper is in there. And yeah, so those are just some general insight things. And if you were to actually look through our trash, you would be able to probably say some of those things with greater certainty. But you get an idea of just by looking at some of the things in our trash, what the types of questions that archaeologists might ask and the types of information we might be looking for. And so there's a broader project that I actually teach to my students about an archaeologist that's actually gone through and excavated parts of garbage disposal locations. And then he's gone back and had his students interview people that their addresses are associated with this particular deposit. And what he's actually found is that in the interviews, people would say that they deposited sort of tighter curated assemblage of things. They would say they're eating healthier than they actually are, or they say they would throw away less things or be less wasteful than they actually are. And so one of the things that I would say about archaeology is that it's not necessarily just about studying the past, right? It's about studying the things people use and the things people have, and that can be meaningful both to studying contemporary human society, right? So he wrote an entire book about sustainability and the things people use and the ways they think about the things that they use and their disposal practices. And so while I am a prehistoric archaeologist, I work in Belize, I study the Maya, which is a society that many of us are unfamiliar with, and the particular time period I study is over 1,000 years ago. The methods that I'm using and the types of analysis that I'm interested in and the questions that I'm asking are all sort of relevant. And there are actually archaeologists that are studying contemporary societies as well. There's an example of an archaeologist in the UK that studies homelessness, and she looks at like the materials of homeless populations. And there are countless other examples. But just as an idea of the types of questions we can ask. Okay, go back on here. Okay, and just to highlight some, we might be able to do some comparison here. Various types of trash deposits. One thing that you could say about the deposit that I've curated for us is that it's a household deposit, right? There are a lot of different things all related to everyday household activities, drinking, eating, baking, all activities that would occur in a house, cleaning yourself. Whereas the earlier example of a trash pit that I showed is mostly all bottles and cans. And so one comparison you could draw here is that this deposit, also paired with its location, is likely not a household deposit, right? It's a lot of the same type of artifact that it's unlikely that one group of or one person or a smaller group of people are going to use these many materials and deposit them in the same place, right? And so you can make a different assessment on that type of collection or assemblage of artifacts than you might do on the one that I've curated for us today. Okay. Do we have any initial questions? I'll have some questions throughout. You could send them in the chat, or you could unmute yourself. I don't know if we're still unmuted, but I'll have other question sessions come up after each of the sessions. I just wanted to check in now and see how we're doing.
I think I do have everybody now able to unmute themselves if they are. Sorry about that before.
All right. Doesn't seem like it. Well, if you think of one while I'm in the next section, go ahead and type it in the chat or save it, and there will be another chat session coming up. Okay, so a little bit about me. So I taught you the basics of archaeology, but how did I get into archaeology? I grew up in Princeton. I went to Princeton Township High School, and I went to college at the U of I Urbana-Champaign, and now I am currently a PhD candidate at Northwestern University. And so growing up, before college, I regularly spent time outside. My dad he always had me outside hunting or just exploring outside, and I became really interested and started to love being outside just from a very young age. Growing up in school, I was a very inquisitive student. I remember a lot of times in high school being the student that would ask questions that the teacher didn't always know the answer to, that I liked learning the material, but I wanted to know more. I wanted to know about the broader processes or other things that were sort of behind the scenes. I wasn't necessarily the type of person that liked to memorize facts and just recite them. I wanted to know, like, why were those facts the way that they were? And so that led me to want to be a researcher, basically. At the time, I had been really interested in astronomy. I was really interested in space, and I see Pam Byrne is in the audience. I was really interested in chemistry, so I applied to UIUC as a dual astronomy and chemistry major. But I learned really fast that physics wasn't for me, and that to do astronomy, you have to be great at physics. So I changed majors within the first week. And that entailed taking a bunch of gen eds, just general classes that would fulfill requirements for me to receive my degree. And one of those gen eds in my first semester of college was in archaeology. It was a world prehistory class. And at the end of the class, because I was still the student that liked to come up to the instructor or the professor after class and ask a million questions, at the end of that class, he said, "Hey, Zach, I know you're interested in this. If you want to become an anthropology major, you're going to have to do field work, and I'm doing a field school this summer." So in 2012, the summer of 2012, I went on my first archaeology dig and was a student at a site in Southern Illinois called Emerald Mound, which, if you're familiar with the archaeology in Southern Illinois at all, it's a satellite site of Cahokia, which is actually, if you haven't been, Cahokia is one of North America's largest pyramids. And so if you're interested in archaeology at all, it's not that far of a drive, and it's a World Heritage Site that we have in Illinois, in St. Louis. So if you haven't gone there, I really encourage you to do so. They have an amazing museum. And none of the stuff that I worked on is there because I was on a sort of academic research project. But Emerald Mound is just a satellite site of Cahokia associated with ritual pilgrimage that's in Lebanon, Illinois. And so it's not too far. But so I did my field school. I realized that I loved archaeology. I got really close to some of the grad students, and I changed my major officially to anthropology and archaeology. And so you can see at age 20, I knew I wanted to be an archaeologist. So my roommate made me an archaeology birthday cake. And so I was doing, because my mentors at the time told me that to be an archaeologist, you have to have field experience or artifact analysis experience. I did some time in the archaeology lab as a volunteer analyzing ceramic artifacts and later lithic artifacts, which are just stone tools basically. And then micro artifacts, which is a specialty of mine now, which is just basically really, really tiny artifacts you have to use a microscope to look at. And so while I knew I was very interested in archaeology, I didn't really want to work in Illinois. I loved archaeology and I loved learning about ancient societies, but myself growing up in the Midwest, I wanted to travel, right? I wanted experience outside of the US. And so one of my faculty mentors, who is actually now one of my greatest friends and allies and mentors within anthropology and archaeology, offered me the opportunity to go to Belize with her in 2014. And so that summer, I went to Belize on the Valley of Peace Archaeology Project, which is located in central Belize, and I worked at an archaeological site in the jungle of Belize, studying a ritual site associated with Maya pilgrimage and water. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about the Maya and give you some background, but there is a period of Maya society where there are a series of really intense droughts between 800 and 900 CE, and that's when this site is used primarily, and it's right next to this cenote, which is a circular body of water. It's basically a sinkhole that's been filled with water, and so you can see the pictures of us next to it, and at one point we tried to dive and look for some of the artifacts under the water, and so that's in the bottom right-hand corner is us climbing into a tree and then jumping in because the sides were too steep. And you would basically just fall right in. So we had to climb into a tree and then jump into the water. And then the top left-hand picture is just me being a tourist in Belize on a jungle survey. But yeah, so that's how I got interested in the Maya by doing some fieldwork in central Belize. And I realized that I really loved it. I loved traveling and being in a different country, getting to know different groups of people. The food is amazing. And so at that time, there's an annual conference in Belize, and I was introduced to my current advisor, Dr. Cynthia Robin, who is based at Northwestern and is the person I work with today. Okay, so that was a relatively quick one. I'm trying to catch up on time. Do we have any other questions so far in the chat or that have emerged about how I got into archaeology?
I have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I wanted to know how you were able to tell that there was a series of droughts so long ago.
So that's actually not my research, but there are actually now from that particular cenote, there are some soil cores that have been collected. And so one principle in archaeology is that soils deposit in layers over time. It's called stratigraphy. And so if you take a really deep core, the same thing kind of happens with ice as well. Even so, that's something that geologists use, but you can take dates from the different layers. And you can assess different dates and different times in different parts of the environment by taking those cores, or you can look at tree rings. Tree rings can show you both dates and both like droughts. If there's not much rainfall, there are smaller rings in the tree. And so it's a bunch of different sets of data that are not my own, but that archaeologists have paired with archaeological data sets to say during this period there was a series of really long, prolonged droughts.
Good, thank you.
There was another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I am in the process of kind of switching career paths with the trajectory of getting my PhD in anthropology. And I just wanted to ask, do you think that it's necessary to have a bachelor's in anthropology? Could I jump in and have do I need to do a master's before I have my PhD? What kind of steps do you think for someone who I have a bachelor's, I have a master's in other fields, what do you think I would need to do to be prepared for PhD work?
What is your background in?
My bachelor's is in communications and technical theater. My master's is in leadership.
Cool.
So very kind of soft work.
The one piece of advice that I have is that grad school is mostly about finding people that they think are going to succeed. And so it's not necessarily always about your background. A lot of it's about connections and getting to know people. So like I said, I got into Northwestern because my mentor at the time introduced me to my advisor and we maintained an email exchange. And so when I applied to work at Northwestern, she was already sort of familiar with who I was and my interests and my background and the types of things I wanted to do for my PhD. And she thought I was a good fit. So I got accepted to Northwestern. And so that's often one of the big things that I see other prospective grad students sort of go through is that they apply to programs where they're not necessarily the greatest fit. So part of the thing you're going to have to do is to explore what programs you want to do, who are the people you'll potentially be working with, and how can you, right, because grad school is a learning environment, they want to take you if they think that they can teach you things, but also that you have enough drive to make it through the program, right? So you need to do this sort of perfect fit that I had interest in ordinary people, and that's what my advisor does, but I didn't have a lot of background in that, right? The two sites that I had worked at beforehand were ritual pilgrimage sites, right? And that's still archaeology experience, but I had no experience actually excavating households. And that was something I had to learn coming in. So for me, as an archaeologist, it's just one of those things I had to figure out the way to sell myself in applying to different programs, knowing who I wanted to work with and trying to convince them that they wanted to work with me as well. So it's not necessarily about your background, it's about how you can pitch yourself and convince people within that program already that you're a good fit to work with them.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. But if you have other questions that you can email me at the end. Too.
I would love to, thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. Other questions? Cool. Okay, so now we can get into my research. So this is where we take the turn from being super general to being really specific, because that's what a PhD is. A PhD is essentially you becoming the expert on a very tiny topic and knowing more about that tiny topic than anyone else in the world. And so my specific topic is urban longevity and social inequality. And so, as I said, my fieldwork is at the ancient Maya city of Aventura, Belize. And Aventura, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, is a site that has a history of 5,000 years. And so one of my interests in working at the site and asking questions about ordinary people is about how ordinary people's lives were impacted by issues of inequality and by, as I'll talk about again in a few minutes, this period of stress. How were ordinary people affected by this at a city that lasted so long? And so my technical description of what I do is I examine urban commoner households, which is just an archaeology term for regular people or those that aren't super wealthy, basically, during a period of social, political, and environmental instability in the broader Maya region. And so you can see some pictures here of me doing fieldwork and just my colleagues. The bottom right hand is our first season. So you can see my advisor in the center, Dr. Cynthia Robin, and then the team that we worked with that summer. And then the picture on the left-hand side is the team that I worked with on my own this past summer of all Belizeans. And so some background. The Maya area is an area that covers what is today known as Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, and Honduras. And so what you can see in the map on the left-hand side is a series of dots, which are all documented and recorded archaeological Maya sites. And so the Maya are a society that lasted a period of thousands of years, which that history has been divided into three parts: the pre-classic, the classic, and the post-classic. But the period the Maya are most well known for, and that we'll talk about today, is the classic period. And so you can see this image on the right-hand side. The classic period is most famously associated with divine rulers. And so this is Lady Shok, one of the most famous Maya queens, conducting a bloodletting ritual, sort of consolidating her power as the ruler of this city. And then there's another Maya king on the left-hand side, and he's sort of presiding over the ritual. So the classic period, as I said, is the most sort of well-known period of the Maya. So that's 250 to 900 CE. And in this period is sort of most well known because it's where the largest monumental sites, when the largest monumental sites are being constructed. And so the pictures here are from the site of Tikal in Guatemala, which is one of the largest Maya cities known to date. And so you can see the image on the right is an image of one of the large monumental temple pyramids, where divine rulers would conduct elaborate displays of their power and consolidate their power and basically establish that they have more wealth and more power than the general population. And on the left-hand side, you see an image of an elite palace. So this is where elites would live, that it's almost as big as the temple pyramid. So this is what these are. If you're going to tour a Maya archaeological site, you'll likely tour Tikal or Chichen Itza in Mexico, and you're going to see things like this. But for my research, I ask questions about ordinary people. And so when I talk about ordinary people, I'm talking about pole and thatch houses that have a sort of small foundation. And so this is a contemporary example of a pole and thatch house. And actually one thing that I didn't talk about is during the classic period. The classic period ends at 900 because from 800 to 900, there's this period of drought, of intense droughts. There's also a series of wars, and it's a period from 800 to 900 where people stop believing in divine rulers. That there have been these intense inequalities for so long that people start to sort of rely on themselves more, right? That elites were in control of resources, they were in control of water, and all of that's sort of slipping away between 800 and 900. So around 900, or between 800 and 900, people start to leave cities. And so divine rulers lose their control over the people. And people in many places leave cities and move to more rural areas. And so a lot of archaeologists talk about this period as the sort of collapse of Maya civilization. And one of my research questions is actually about what happens to ordinary people, because the end of the classic period is just the end of a political institution, right? The people don't disappear, they just move out of cities, the really famous cities. But that people still live in the Maya area, they still live really complicated and complex lives. And so that story is a story of ordinary people. And so my interest in all of this is, during this period of stress, what happens to ordinary people? And basically, are all cities abandoned? And so one of the things that we can jump into now is that I've already said that Aventura is a site that has a long history of occupation, and it is actually occupied throughout this transition period from the classic to the post-classic. The site core, where all the monumental buildings are located, you can see our image of the sort of overview plan map of the site. A lot of these buildings were being used during this transition period, which indicates to us as archaeologists that this is a city that's not being abandoned during the end of the classic period. And that it actually, and having done a lot of our survey, it's an economically diverse urban community that thrives during the classic to post-classic transition. And so you can see this image here on the left is a sort of refined version of that initial map that I showed you. And it shows the different group types, which are just grouped by basically the size. And so I've gone through, this is actually my original map, which is an analysis of the different sizes of groups. And so one thing you can see here in the pink, I'm sorry if you have a small screen, you can't see the image very well. It works really well in a sort of in-person blown up image, but it's sort of smaller on screens here. But you can see the little pink rectangles are commoner households or ordinary people. The blue houses are this sort of mid-range where people have larger houses, but they're not monumental buildings, or they're not super big. And then the green blocks are really large, multiple meter buildings. And these, one of the things that I'll show you later is that the commoner households are these pole and thatch buildings, whereas the elite buildings are all stone. They're houses, they're smaller versions of the palace that I showed you at Tikal, that they're all stone. The walls are stone, the roofs are stone, the foundation is stone, whereas the commoner households are pole and thatch with some, it's basically a rubble pile that they put a floor on top of, and then they built a pole and thatch house. And so one of the things that I look at is what were those people's lives like during this period? We know Aventura is a thriving city during the classic to post-classic transition, but what does that actually mean, right? And the only way you can actually know what that means is by excavating households and seeing what people are doing. And so you can see some images here of us doing survey. It involves the image in the center is actually the main temple of Aventura, which is the big square or the big gray rectangle in the center of the map. It's a 20-meter tall temple pyramid. And so to do our survey, we have to hack up to the top of it. And then we use a total data station, which was the yellow machine on the right, to sort of take geographical information about the different features. And so that machine is what's made us able to make this digital map of the ancient city. And so, as I said, given that this broader period of the classic to post-classic transition is a period of high inequality and regional stress, what are the impacts of this stress on the ordinary people that lived at Aventura? Were these lower socioeconomic households included or excluded from the broader community, both in terms of economic resources and social resources? One of the things that I'm really interested in is parsing out, what does inequality mean during a period of stress? Is it just like, I don't have the money to buy things, or is it that I'm being socially excluded from things, that people with more resources are grouping themselves together and excluding those that don't have wealth? Those are the types of questions that I'm asking because I'm interested in what the socioeconomic formulations that made Aventura thrive, what did those mean for everyday people, right? Did Aventura survive because the wealthy hoarded their wealth and were able to just persist in a way and maintain control of resources in a way that other cities weren't able to. Or was Aventura a city where maybe some inequality existed, but that those at the bottom were better integrated? And so during this period of stress, people were less angry and they didn't decide to move, that they stayed. Maybe they had access to more resources. And so that's one of the things that, that I'm talking about and I'm looking at in my excavations. And so here you can see some examples of excavations that I have done at the site. On the left-hand side, you see a vertical excavation of from the bedrock all the way up to the floor. So what you can see here is that there's a really flat surface on the top. Then you see a bunch of rocks, and then you see some dirt, and then you see some limestone. So, oh, I have a cursor I can highlight for you. So here is the floor. Here is some rubble that would have basically raised the house. And then here's some dirt. And then here is the limestone bedrock. And so what you can see here is that the actual house part isn't preserved, right? That pole and thatch is organic material and that it hasn't preserved. And so on the right-hand side, this past summer, I did a bigger horizontal excavation is what it's called, to expose basically the entire house, the floor. And so you can see here, this series of stones form the wall. So this would be the foundation of the house. And that the wall is basically at the same level as the floor. So while there was some stone architecture, it wasn't very high. And actually what I found evidence of in the front part here is that there was some sort of softer limestone plaster that has probably softened as time has gone on and it sort of sunk. That maybe was a facade to the house, but that the majority of the house would have been this pole and thatch structure that I showed earlier. And so here again is an example. You can see here at the bottom, there's this stone, there's this concrete foundation in the contemporary house, and then you've got pole tied together and then a thatch roof, right? And so the thatch roof would basically do all of the shelter needs you have. And pole and thatch is actually much cooler than a stone building. Breezes can actually get through there. But it's less of a sort of status statement than the hard labor it would require to build an all stone building. And so what this suggests to me is actually that there is some inequality at Aventura. Not everyone's house looks the same. Some people's houses are much smaller and required much less energy to build. And so there is some level of inequality at Aventura during this period. And so here's another example. There is an example from one of my colleagues on the Aventura project, Casey Grauer. She excavated an elite household. And so what you can see here, it also has a wall, but it's a gigantic standing up wall that would have been a petition for the entire house. So this is the wall standing up if you're looking at it straight on. And so all of inside of here was filled in by just dirt and collapse, but that's where people would have lived. And then the front part of it has this series of stepped terraces that would have just given this really grand facade to the building. And so it would be similar to the little plaster facade that I described in the household that I excavated. So this just is further evidence that there are differences socioeconomically between the households at Aventura. But one of the interesting things that I found is that the artifact deposits are relatively similar. The elite households do have some nicer things, but ordinary people aren't being excluded from buying things. So one example of this is that I found obsidian artifacts, which is essentially like volcanic glass that can make really sharp tools, right? But obsidian is not local to Aventura. It would have had to be traded for, likely from Mexico, right? So that would require traveling artifacts long distances to get to this city, and then the people in the city have to basically go buy them from a market. And so what it suggests is that people had expendable income to buy things from a market, right? Long distance trade items. They also had really nice pottery. Pottery can be made by ordinary people. It doesn't have to be super nice stuff. Elites can buy super nice pottery, but for some reason, people at Aventura were able to have this. And so in comparison to other sites that I described that are abandoned, a lot of ordinary people at these sites are only using basic pottery types. They don't have access to obsidian. They're using local hard stone to make tools. But at Aventura, ordinary people, people at all levels of society have access to these goods, just in smaller quantities, right? If you look at the trash deposit from an elite house, it's much larger, and they're throwing things away that you could probably fix up and reuse, whereas the smaller households are sort of using those things over longer periods of time before replacing them. Another interesting thing is that ordinary people are participating in ancestor veneration, which is just the special treatment of ancestors, basically, people that have passed on. And so for the Maya, there's a pattern of burying your ancestors in your house. And so the Maya would build their house one on top of another over time. And so I'm finding evidence, even in my small households, that people are doing this. And what this does, archaeologists have shown in patterns at other sites, is that this builds a sense of community, that you're from this place, and that it's a ritual practice that's public, that other people see going on. And so when someone important to your family dies, you bury them in your house and you conduct this elaborate ceremony that everyone in the community can see, right? And so at abandoned sites where there's a lot of inequality, ordinary people are just socially excluded from this practice. And what's happening is that elites are doing this in really confined spaces, or they're doing it in the city center, basically establishing themselves as the only people that have the rightful claim to sort of ancestry and being a member of this community. And what happens at Aventura is suggesting, I still have some more research to do to sort of substantiate these claims, which is, I was supposed to be in Belize right now doing my final season of excavations, but I'm here in Chicago still. But basically what I'm finding in my preliminary data sets is that this pattern doesn't compare to sites that are being abandoned, right? That for some reason, there's this sort of economic and social collectivity. While there are clearly some differences, some people have more resources and more social capital than others, but it's not extreme, right? And so that's one of the things that I'm interested in, and that it might say something for why the city is occupied for thousands of years in ways that other sites have a sort of quick burn and bust sort of model to them, that they're occupied for a couple hundred years or whatever, or that they get really big for a couple hundred years and then they're left, right? And that the small farming communities around these big cities are the places that are occupied for longer periods of time. And that's not a pattern we're seeing as much at Aventura. So that's a quick snapshot of my research. I want to thank you all for coming today. And I'm open to any questions you might have that come up. And as I said, my email is here. Feel free to shoot me an email, or if you're watching a recording and you have questions, feel free to send me an email and I would be more than happy to answer them for you. But now we can open the floor for any questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask additional questions.
Zach, one of the questions I have is do you, I mean, aside from the higher status artifacts showing up in the, the ordinary households, is there evidence of interaction? Like, and are there things you can tell how the ordinary folks and the elite folks interacted?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm interested in trying to find in my next research season is evidence of feasting, basically. The deposits that I've looked at now are basically just like regular household stuff. I'm kind of basically looking for evidence of parties in between houses, which would lend further support to this idea that there's sort of social collectivity happening. unfortunately for the household that I excavated, it was so close to the, last summer, it was so close to the surface that most of the deposits were disturbed in some way, which is actually why I excavated it when I did, because I knew over time that household was just going to disappear. It was one of the smallest households we'd identified at the site. So I wanted to excavate it pretty quickly. But what that means is that a lot of the outside of the house deposits that aren't being protected by the mound itself have sort of been destroyed. And so I've been doing what's called a post hole test, is I take a post hole digger and I dig into the ground, these really small holes, and you just collect artifacts at equal intervals. So I basically have this grid that extends outside of the house to try and identify collections of artifacts. And basically what I'm hoping to find is in one of those post holes, I have tons of ceramics in one post hole, and then I would go back out and excavate that spot, hopefully to find some evidence of basically the remains of a party. That's been shown at other sites to be evidence of social gathering because it's large groups of people coming together. Another way you could do this, and that people have done this, is by looking at performance spaces in a site core. That was actually my original dissertation idea, but I was really interested in the idea of what ordinary people are doing in their homes rather than in the city center. So I haven't excavated in the city center, but it's something that I've considered going back to. But yeah, that's another way you could answer that question. But you would just miss out on the what are regular people doing on their day-to-day, which was one of my sort of primary questions.
Okay, and we do have some questions in the chat. Do you want me to ask them, or do you want to? Can you see them?
You can ask them, sure.
Okay, so we have, how did your team come together since everyone has different specialties and areas of study? Do you work only with your lab at Northwestern or join other labs?
So the main thing is that we're all connected by my advisor. So my advisor has 2 graduate students that do a lot of the research for her, or with her, sorry. We have our own side projects basically, but she's the person that really connects everyone. So she has 2 graduate students, me and Casey Grauer, who I showed some of her excavations earlier, that do some bigger research projects. And then she sort of connects people. When she gets big grants, she brings other students along to do some work for her. But as far as specialists go, they're all people that she's basically colleagues with. So like our ceramicist works at multiple different sites, and they come for shorter periods of time to just look at all of the ceramics, and it's colleagues that my advisor has worked with for years. And so actually this season we were supposed to bring down even more specialists, but because of COVID, we're postponing a year. And so we connect through my advisor, who is the primary investigator on the team.
Okay.
But yeah, most of our stuff is done through Northwestern as well.
Okay. Let's see. So Pam Byrne is asking, what's been the most interesting item you've excavated?
This might be a boring answer to some of you, but because my interests are in ordinary people, I think the most exciting find that I've found is actually a burial in this small household last summer. I wasn't expecting to find any remains or ritual deposits at all, because the big narrative in studies of Maya cities for a long time has been that there are the super rich and there are the super poor, right? And that the super poor are fully excluded from economic and social circles. And so I just wasn't expecting to find any evidence of ritual at all, that it was something only elites had the knowledge to do. And so finding a burial at all, and finding a burial that had a consistent pattern with elite burials at the site, was really fascinating for me. I think before that burial, one of the most exciting things was also related to these broader narratives within my discipline. I found a carved shell bead, which again, it was actually from the same household, which is why I went back to excavate it. I did some test excavations in 2018, and I found this little tiny shell bead at this tiny household, which suggested to me that this household was able to purchase specialized craft items that you wouldn't expect if this household was the ultra poor that I thought it was supposed to be based on other narratives and of Maya sites. So I think that was the most spectacular thing for me. But we've found like intense jade pendants and other jade items at our site, which I think is probably the thing like people are most excited to hear about when we describe the site, is the really pretty things. But for me, it was those little things that you're not expecting to find, or that you're quote unquote not supposed to find, that really ask new questions about our knowledge of Maya history that are really interesting to me.
And then a question from Sandy. How are these sites found? Do you and your team locate them? How do you do that? And also, are the sites protected currently? Are they in danger from curious tourists? Actually, I was going to ask about that, especially since you're not there this summer. You know,
Yeah.
Are you having concerns about looting and things like that?
Yeah, so the one thing about the Maya is that there are sites everywhere. There's a joke that Mayanists have that you can't throw a shovel without hitting an archaeological feature. And so one of the things is at least for these bigger sites, like cities have been documented, have long histories of documentation. That Aventura's first sort of note on the books of being excavated was in the early 1900s. There's a publication from 1905 by a guy named Thomas Gahn that came through, and he excavated. He dug a giant hole and didn't take any notes at a site that he says is by San Joaquin, which is the village that we work out of, that he calls Aventura. So that's Aventura's first note on the books. But a lot of these sites have been found by archaeologists and people exploring the jungle, or a lot of archaeologists will go and talk to communities and say, do you know of any archaeological sites or materials? Can you take me and show me? And then once the sites themselves have been documented, then you do the survey, the picture I showed of archaeologists fanning out and walking and taking notes and drawing what you find. And then you take the total data station, which has GPS data in it, and you geographically create a map that is referenceable. And so that's sort of how you find sites and how you find features within a site. The sites are technically protected by the government. Belize has a law that anything that is buried is property of the government. And so it is illegal to excavate any archaeological materials without permission of the government. But obviously that doesn't stop looting. I think one thing that we've really focused on is actually community engagement. And so Aventura is a site that is located right next to the main highway. And there are two major highways in Belize, the Western Highway and the Northern Highway. And Aventura is located right on the Northern Highway. Driving on the Northern Highway, you can see the main temple. Actually, am I on here? Oh, this picture here is standing on the road. So you can see here that that's the main temple, and that there are a lot of monumental buildings here in the bush. And so actually for where I work, there's sugarcane agriculture, and basically you can't plant sugarcane on top of archaeological features. There's just not enough dirt. The cane can't grow. And so archaeological sites are often these areas of really dense forest, right? Whereas everywhere that there isn't an archaeological feature, people are growing sugarcane. So that's how we can find sites in the north. But because it's so close to the highway, not only can you see it, there are very clear ways to find these places. It's been highly looted. And so one of the main things that we've done is community engagement. It's just getting locals involved. You saw the pictures of our team. It's often like 10 people from the US, Canada, or the UK, and like 30 Belizeans, all that we hire from Meet the Local Village. So one of the big things that we've done is really try to engage locals and sort of create a sort of sense of stewardship and teaching about like what people have in their backyard, and getting people interested. And we've actually seen a reduction in looting because it's a place that people are sort of seeing in a different light. and also just we're there more frequently. So we have thought about, there are a lot of sites that become archaeological reserves. I think my project is a little hesitant to do that because when you create an archaeological reserve, it becomes inaccessible until it's made a tourist site. That armed guards get situated. And I think one of the really interesting things, which is a side project I've been working on, is how locals today interact with the site and the sort of meanings that locals today sort of generate in interacting with the site on a daily basis in a way that you can't get if it becomes a reserve and no one has access to. So I think our emphasis on engagement and collaboration with the local community has been the big thing that we've been doing. Cool.
Yeah, so yeah, and Sandy has another question. Are your digs funded by Northwestern or private organizations, businesses? You mentioned grants, but
Yeah.
What else?
So the big thing that we do is grants. So like the season that I was supposed to do this summer is funded by the National Science Foundation. So that's a grant that I have all on my own. But my advisor also has a big grant through the National Science Foundation. There's a humanities endowment that you can get grants through. Northwestern does offer a lot of funding as well. So it's sort of a balance of like archaeology, because we hire so many people and it requires a lot of specialized equipment, it can get very expensive, that it's not something we pay for out of pocket. So the big thing I do when I'm not teaching or writing, when I'm not in Belize, is applying for grants. That it actually took me years to get the National Science Foundation grant. And so we spend a lot of time writing funding applications and perfecting funding applications and trying to convince people to give us money to do research.
And I do have one question, kind of just, okay, so one of my personal excavation experiences is Pat Manahan, who's the local postman, excavates cisterns and outhouses locally. And so he did my yard. So one of the interesting things is it was an old summer kitchen, and the substrate for whatever he was finding in the outhouse was basically berry seeds, because that was what people were eating and that's what was left. I'm kind of curious what, when you're digging, what is kind of the noise that you're finding things? I mean, is there something that's basically sort of like, yeah, we've got 1,000 of these versus that one jade pendant?
Yeah, and the big thing that we find is ceramics, basically, the remains of pottery, because ceramics are made from clay and they're fired and they're very durable, so they don't degrade in a way that most organic materials do, unless it's a special circumstance. So that's why we have a special person who specializes in the study of ceramics. So I know basics, but a lot of our dating actually comes from ceramics, because you find so many ceramics and ceramic styles change through time, that if you get enough radiocarbon dates, you can sort of pair with the ways that ceramic styles change over time, that just by looking at a ceramic or a group of ceramics, by assessing the style, you can get a rough time range that the feature that you're excavating was used by. So ceramics are the big thing that we find. We also find, one surprising thing in the household that I excavated was we found less stone tools than I expected. But stone tools are another thing that you find a lot of. And just for me, because I excavate households, I find a lot of rocks, because it's the main construction material. So I dig through a lot of rock. That's the big thing that we find.
Cool. Any other questions? Either you throw it in the chat or do you want to speak up? Okay, cool. Well, there's Zach's information. I will also, hopefully by the end of the week, if not sooner, get this up on the library YouTube page, and I'll put a link on the library website. So if you need to come back and revisit it, or if you want to share this with somebody who's missed it, you'll be able to do that. Thanks so much, Zach. It's been really, really exciting to hear what you've been doing and seeing this. I think it was a really, I appreciate the journey that you described in it. So not only the research, but your journey to get there. I thought it was a great one.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. This is great. I love giving these kinds of talks. So
Cool. Well, otherwise I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you for attending. And again, once this is up on YouTube, please kind of get the word out, because this was too good information not to do it. And I'm kind of interested in more people getting access to it. So
Thank you.
thanks very much. And I'll say goodnight.
Good night.